In this presentation, we're going to be highlighting the Gulf issue of invasive species. So first off, we need to define what the heck even is an invasive species. So this is an organism, which means a plant, an animal, a fungus, or bacterium that's one, not native to a specific location, and two, has negative effects on the economy, the environment, and your human health. When you're thinking about an invasive species, you need to ignore the geopolitical borders of states, right? So within a state, you can have multiple ecoregions. So we're looking more at the function of this organism in the place where it's at. So an invasive species typically harms native species through predation, habitat degradation, and competition for shared resources. And they're a really big deal. So invasive species are the leading cause of population decline and extinction in animals. If we take a look at the pictures above, the first example is a bit far away. It's from my hometown, Michigan. So we've got sea lampreys, and they are a really big issue in Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. The second photo, Don't Be Daft, Please Clean Your Watercraft, is showcasing how an invasive species, particularly they're showing European water milfoil, can move from one spot to the other. And this is on a smaller scale. It might be a recreational fishing boat that you take out onto a body water. And when you come back on land, it's really important to clean off your boat. If you don't, that European water milfoil will cling on to the underside of the boat. And now when you enter in a different source of water, you're spreading that invasive. So within the Gulf, the first species that we're really going to hone in on is lionfish. So first, let's get a little bit of background. There's a video that's made by the National Marine Institute, and we're going to take a look.
Have you ever wondered what an alien invasion looks like underwater? These spiny creatures are lionfish, and they are taking over the Atlantic. The lionfish invasion may pose one of the greatest ever man-made threats to Atlantic coral reefs. After being first released from aquariums in the 1980s, lionfish have aggressively invaded habitats in the southeast United States, the Caribbean Sea, and Gulf of Mexico. Right now, the best way we have of dealing with the lionfish problem is killing them by spearfishing. It's easy and effective, but only in fairly shallow water, and only in areas frequented by divers. Holland scholar Emily Wallingford spent this summer working with lionfish expert Dr. James Morris. They were searching for ways to make lionfish easier to catch without having to rely on the continual effort of divers.
I've been doing tank experiments this summer, testing to see if lionfish have a preference between horizontal and vertical structure.
What we're going to try and do here is learn more about lionfish behavior and their affinity and attraction for these types of structures, and exploit that using these devices that will hopefully allow us to aggregate lionfish and increase efficiency for spearfishers.
Here is the horizontal structure that we've been using in the tank, and then the vertical structures in the tree shape over there. What I do is set up individual and group experiments with these two devices to see if the fish spend more time on the horizontal structure versus the vertical structure.
We still have quite a bit to learn about lionfish. These ruthless invaders are changing the aquatic landscape throughout Atlantic marine environments. Emily's research will aid scientists in the greater fight against lionfish. It's one battle in a larger war. Stay tuned next week to learn more about what we are finding in the stomachs of...
And on to part 2.
It could be a bad day for this lionfish, but it's a hopeful sign for Atlantic coral reefs. This is rare footage of a grouper eating a lionfish, and it's not a common occurrence in the Atlantic. Lionfish have no known natural predators, one of the biggest reasons for their success. And lionfish will eat just about anything that swims in front of them, up to half of their own body size. Holling scholar John Peake worked this summer with Dr. James Morris, dissecting lionfish stomachs to see what they are eating. Are they picky eaters or gluttons? And how will that affect the impact on native fish and their ecosystems?
What I've been doing is dissecting lionfish stomachs and looking at what they've been eating, try to identify potential ecological and economic impacts of lionfish invasion.
Lionfish do have a negative impact. In parts of the Bahamas, 40% of the biomass on some reefs is lionfish, and the native species that normally reside on these reefs have been reduced by 65%.
At least in these samples, there are a lot of parrotfish, which is a really interesting fact for the environment because parrotfish are a key species in reducing algae growth on coral reefs. The fact that lionfish are eating a lot of parrotfish means that they're having a harmful effect on the ecosystem.
Over time, we may begin to see more of groupers and other large fish eating these invaders. Nature may solve this problem on its own. Or the solution could come from something we haven't even considered. Next week, we will examine whether the lionfish we see in the Atlantic are
So we're going to break down why lionfish are such a big deal into 4 pieces. All right, so on this first slide, lionfish reproduce year-round. So mature females, which means someone that is over a year old, release 50,000 eggs every 3 days for the rest of their lives. And once they're mature, they can live for 30 years. So a single female lionfish spawns over 2 million eggs per year. And if you look at a common reef fish, they're only spawning once a year. So it's really easy to see how lionfish can quickly outnumber native fish populations. All right, so when did we first even see the lionfish and how that's correlating to how fast they reproduce? The first lionfish ever recorded in the Western Atlantic, so east coast of the United States, Caribbean Sea, and the Gulf of Mexico, was a specimen that was captured near Dania, Florida in 1985. Fortunately, there were no other lionfish sightings until 1992. Unfortunately, the most likely source of these fish was the home aquarium trade. So at first, the spread of the lionfish population was gradual, but then in 2000, the number of sightings increased exponentially. By 2009, lionfish were pretty well established along the Atlantic coast and throughout the Caribbean. In 2010, sightings were also recorded in the northwestern Gulf of Mexico, along the coast of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Between 2004 and 2008, lionfish densities at sites off of North Carolina increased 700%. So in some locations, scientists have found hundreds of lionfish per acre. So lionfish have become established throughout most of the Caribbean in less than 3 years. All right, issue number 2. Lionfish have 18 venomous spines. So 13 spines are found at the front of the dorsal fin, 2 at the front edge of each pelvic fin, and 1 at the front edge of the anal fin. So as you can imagine, an encounter with a lionfish can have really painful consequences, not only for us, but also potential predators. And no matter the size, all lionfish sport these spines along their back, their pelvis, and their underside. And they use these protrusions for defense. So when a lionfish spine punctures flesh, the pressure pushes out toxin from 2 venom glands along the fish's backbone. Okay, and then this poison rushes through channels on either side of the backbone, through the spine, and into the victim. In humans, lionfish stings can cause intense pain, sweating, and even in extreme cases, respiratory distress, and paralysis. Now, the intensity and the duration of these effects does depend on an individual's sensitivity to the toxin and how many of the 18 spines have stabbed them. So the third issue is that lionfish don't have a natural predator within their invasive range. We're not entirely certain what eats lionfish in their native range, but it's most likely large predators like grouper, as we saw in that first video, snapper, eels, and sharks. So we're hopeful that these same predator groups, the snapper, the eels, the sharks, the groupers, will someday figure out in the Gulf that, hey, we can eat lionfish. Unfortunately, that won't happen quickly, and it doesn't help in areas where these predator groups have already been overfished. Now, the fourth issue is that lionfish aren't recognized as predators. So what this means is that native fish and invertebrates don't know to avoid lionfish to keep from being eaten, right? Like they've never seen this fish before, so they haven't learned that danger, danger, stay away from this fish. And unfortunately for them, lionfish are indiscriminate eaters. So if it fits in their mouth, they're going to eat it. So this includes many smaller species of fish and invertebrates that are important herbivores. So those herbivores keep check on algae on the reef. It also includes the young of commercially important fish species, such as snapper. So not only can this affect the ecological balance of the reef system, but it can also impact fisheries. 1,000 lionfish can eat 5 million prey fish in 1 year alone. And you can get a sense of this just by looking at the photo above. So all of those fish were eaten by one lionfish at the same time. So moving to a more positive light, how can we start to mitigate the effects of lionfish? Well, one solution has been a lionfish derby, which is a single-day competition to collect and remove as many lionfish as possible. So what this looks like is participants attend a mandatory captain's meeting with a presentation about lionfish biology, their ecology, their impacts, collecting and handling techniques, right? Because they have those, how many? Yes, 18 venomous spines. And then they go over derby rules. So teams collect lionfish by netting or spearing, and they can be scuba diving, free diving, or snorkeling. At the end, each fish is measured and prizes are awarded for teams catching the most, the biggest, and the smallest lionfish. The public is invited to watch, so there's scoring, you can taste free lionfish samples, you can watch filleting and dissection demonstrations, and ask any questions about the lionfish. So let's watch this video to get a better sense. So when we look at the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary, which is in the Gulf Coast, it's really close to us, this one-day derby is not a sustainable event. So what they have instead is a lionfish invitational. So this is a 4-day event. It's a science-based research expedition in which 11 dive teams work to remove as many lionfish as possible. And in doing so, they also record helpful data on lionfish activity and sightings. Okay, and then a science team of 8 divers conducts surveys to determine what species, quantities, and sizes of fish are present at each designated site before and after the removals. A second mitigation effort has been eating lionfish. So they've caught the attention of the hungriest predators of all, us, right? So once you strip it of its venomous spines, you clean it and you fillet it like any other fish, they become delectable seafood fare. So let's see some of the different meals that you can create.
Lionfish can be prepared to anyone's taste. Deep fried, blackened and sauteed, and even made into sushi. And with so many other recipes and such a bountiful supply, don't hesitate to ask for seconds. Eating lionfish is a catchy and delicious solution to the population problem. So why wait? Get them on your plate.
The second species that we're going to be honing in on is the invasive orange cup coral. So orange cup coral is a hard coral species from the Indo-Pacific that has established itself throughout the tropical Western Atlantic. So this includes the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. Although it is a hard coral, it is classified as ahermatypic, meaning that it's not a reef-building coral. And it also lacks any symbiotic algae. So that means it's not dependent on photosynthesis for food production. And in fact, it actually prefers shaded vertical areas such as dock pilings, small caves, and walls beneath overhanging ledges. So orange cup coral was first absorbed in Puerto Rico in 1943. And there are two ways that we predict orange cup coral has been moving. So the first one is that it's spread via typical current patterns in the Caribbean, gradually migrating to the southeast along the coast of Brazil and northwest into the Gulf of Mexico. The second way is at ballast water. And so first let's understand what ballast water is. This is either fresh or salt water, and sometimes it contains sediments that are held in tanks and cargo holds of ships. And the reason why the ships are taking in this water is it helps them increase their stability and maneuverability during the transit, right? So it's really advantageous in that, it's increasing propeller immersion, which improves the steering, and it controls trim and draft. However, once you get from point A to point B and you release that water, you're also discharging plants, animal, viruses, and microorganisms from point A, now in point B. So orange cup coral can have been something that got brought up into the ballast water and then released. The reason why we're seeing the orange cup coral really thriving is that they have really enjoyed the oil and gas production platforms. So when we look at these platforms, we see that the orange cup coral becomes the dominant coral species. There are hundreds of thousands of colonies on a single platform. And in the Gulf of Mexico, there are 2,000 to 3,000 platforms, at any given time. So it's really easy to see how this orange cup coral has arrived in the floral garden banks. Another big issue with orange cup coral is that they displace native corals and sponges. So the more hard surface areas that are colonized by invasive cup coral, the less space is available for native corals and sponges to establish themselves. Okay, we also see that orange cup coral is using chemical defenses to prevent other benthic invertebrates from settling nearby. And it also wards off predators from eating it. So it's a pretty resilient coral. Another issue is that orange cup coral can reproduce within 1.5 years of settling. So what this looks like is they release planule larvae that float with the current for up to 14 days before settling. So in that 14 days, the orange cup coral can get pretty far. So moving to a more positive, how are we starting to get rid of the orange cup coral? Well, the primary response has been physical removal. So by keeping the cup coral from becoming too established, the hope is that it'll lessen its impact on native coral and sponge populations. As one example, in July 2012, sanctuary researchers discovered a section of reef at West Flower Garden Bank that was covered in orange cup coral. And within 45 minutes, they removed 200 colonies. Now, even if you aren't a specialist, you can still help the situation. So you can monitor and report any sightings of orange cup coral within the sanctuary. When you do so, include the date, the time, and location of the sighting, as well as an approximate heading and distance from the nearest mooring buoy. And then you email that sighting to flowergardenbank@noaa.gov. Moving into some art inspiration surrounding invasive species, we're first going to look at Minnesota State University Anna Haglin. So she noticed that they had a lot of invasive prairie plants. And so their solution was to actually create their own paper from the invasive reed canary grass. The second artist that we're going to highlight is this Belizean jeweler who would add sea glass, shells, and gemstones. But then 4 years ago, she decided, why not add lionfish fins? And lastly, we're going to look at some student inspiration. So in this comic piece, Louis Song highlights the invasion of the green crab. And to see more student work like this, visit boseat.org.